For those of you who don't know who we are, this is the St. Anne de Vaudeville Historical Society, and we're a group of people locally. Most of our members are from St. Anne, Centerville, and Bay du Fay, and we get together to talk about subjects of historical interest, and this is one of them. Our speaker today, Madame Marianne Roy, is going to talk about the history of the former estate of Senator Famille Forget, and she's well qualified to do so, having lived on that estate in the fair part of her youth, and being a descendant of Senator Roy. So, a few things that we can pass on. Marianne was born in 1947 in Montreal. Her parents were Raymond Chevalier and Georges Roy. That family lived in the house in Centerville next door to where she grew up. That house was 330, and the house next door was 328. Marianne went to school in the École de Centerville. Now that school probably is not there anymore, and I guess
it's the blue house.
Okay, it is still there.
It's not a school.
It's not a school, okay. But we can go and look at it. She attended school there from the 1st to the 6th grade, and a bit of a story here. Walking through school and home every day. At the end of the day, she would go to the farm and pick eggs with a farmhand named Matt. She was allowed to bring one egg home, and her mother would cook the lunch for her. And often enough, early morning, she would join Mac at the piggery and help him feed the pigs. And he would boil up barley for them, and she would produce a wonderful smell. However, her schoolmates didn't think much of the barn smells. She come to class, and she would say, "Chee-pee, chee-pee." After that, after elementary school, Marianne commuted to Montreal in order to continue school in French. Eventually, she got a law degree from the University of Quebec Montreal, but did not practice law. As an adult, she mainly worked in community organizations and coalitions in Montreal and the rest of Quebec. Marianne's mother sold the house in Centerville in the early 80s and moved up to the Huntington area where the family lives now. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Marianne Roy.
Bonjour tout le monde. I'll just warn you, beginning, that I'm just at the end of I've had 6 weeks this new virus, or SVB, and I'm still coughing quite a bit, so I'm not contagious, but I might have to stop and have a coughing fit once or twice, and that's why I need the mic also, because I can't talk very loud. So I'd first like to thank the Historical Society for inviting me to make this presentation about the Raymond Forget family. Many of Louis-Joseph and Marie-Hermine's descendants have been lucky enough to have called Centerville their home since the 1980s to now. So this first photo is Marie-Hermine Raymond and Louis-Joseph Forget. I think they're standing in front of the house in Montreal. But for those of you who knew my mother, you can certainly see the resemblance with Marie-Hermine. Anyhow, I'll try to give you an idea of who Louis-Joseph Forget and Marie-Hermine Raymond were and their lives together, how he came to prominence, the history of their property, and what's happened to it since then, since he died in 1911. First, the family origins of each of them. So Louis-Joseph is part of the 7th generation of our line of Forgets in France. Nicolas Forget probably arrived around 1652, 201 years before Louis-Joseph's birth. Pretty well all those in the preceding generations of Louis-Joseph were farmers. Nicolas was also a fur trader, which appears to have been what he really would have liked to have done, but wasn't able to. Those of my generation, of whom there are several here, belong to the 10th generation of Forgets here in Quebec. And there is, of course, already an 11th and a 12th generation. So Louis-Joseph was born in Terrebonne on March 11th, 1853. His father, Francois, had 18 children with 3 different wives. Louis-Joseph's mother, the third, Apolline Rimet, was the third. So Louis-Joseph was the last child of all those 18 children who survived to adulthood. I think there was one after him who had died. To show you a picture that my cousin Danielle and I went and found the house with another cousin. Actually, this is the house where Louis-Joseph was born, obviously somewhat modernized from the outside. Probably no doubt on the inside too. You can see the stone here on the above. Oh, yeah, 1820. That was when he built the house. It's actually, if anybody's interested, it's for sale now for about $600,000 in Terrebonne. But up till now, and including now, it still belongs to Forgets since 1820.
Wow.
That was pretty exciting. Some members of that 7th generation were the first to leave the land, probably a conjunction of industrialization, scarcity of land. People had to move to the cities to find work. And 3 of his brothers, David, who was the father of Rodolphe Forget, he became a lawyer, Octave became a notary, and Alphonse, the closest to Louis-Joseph in age, also became a lawyer. And one sister seems to have moved to Montreal. That's where she was buried, in any case. And see if I can get this right. No. So that's Rose de Lima. And that's Alphonse, his brother Alphonse, who looks remarkably like, or I should say, Louis-Joseph looks remarkably like his older brother. Okay, so Louis-Joseph and those 3 brothers studied at Collège Masson in Terrebonne. And here we find the first link to the Raymonds, Marie-Hermine's family, because Sophie Masson, who was the founder of the college, was also Maria's great aunt. Sophie Masson and Joseph Masson were the seigneurs of Terrebonne. So here's a photo of Louis-Joseph as a young man. There's no date, but if you look at it carefully, he was fairly young, and maybe this is a school tie or something, I have no idea. So shortly after his studies at Collège Masson, he went to work in Montreal as a clerk in the accounting department of Crazer and Capital. For a long time, I was sort of under the impression that this was some kind of hardware store. However, during the research, I found that it was at the time one of the most important wholesale hardware companies in Canada. It had also branched out into maritime transportation, fire insurance, and one of the partners was registered in 1874 as a bank. All this no doubt contributed to Louis-Joseph's interest and knowledge in the business world that would serve him in the future. In February of 1874, Louis-Joseph was admitted to the recently founded Montreal Stock Exchange before his 21st birthday, and he was the first French Canadian to do so. The $800 that he paid for the seat was probably advanced by his former employers, Craven and Caverhill. Amusing thing here. Well, I don't know if this is going to work. So, I don't know if you can see it here. So this is in the levels. You're all old enough to remember what levels were. In 1873, he's listed here, Louis Forget clerk, living on Notre Dame, or working on Notre Dame, I'm not sure. And then the following year, for the next 2 years, Forget LJ, stockbroker, 96 Saint-François-Xavier, beds at Canada Hotel on First Gabrielle Street. That was so neat. Okay, now we'll switch over to Marie-Hermine's family. So her first ancestor in Nouvelle-France was Jean-Baptiste Maurice Raymond, and he was mentioned for the first time in 1753, so 100 years later than Louis Joseph's first ancestor, Nicolas, had arrived. So the next 2 generations after the first guy, Jean-Baptiste Raymond and his son Jean-Louis, the first one died in 1825 and the second in 1843, were both prominent examples of local and regional elites from Canada at the time. They were both born in the La Prairie area. Photos of the Vanois bought by Jean-Baptiste in 1800. Obviously, it's a bit decrepit in this photo, but photo of the Manoir, bought by Jean-Baptiste around 1800, was the original site of the first seigneurial manoir built by Jean-Baptiste Lebert de Senneville. So I thought that was an interesting link too, with Fort Senneville. This house was torn down in 1929, apparently. So those 2 generations, Jean-Baptiste and Jean-Louis, right? They were merchants, manufacturers, justices of the peace, and politicians. They also supported Louis-Joseph Papineau and the Parti des Canadiens and were against the union of the 2 Canadas. Both are to be found in the Dictionary of Canadian Biography, as well as many of their sons-in-laws. Links by marriage were very important, of course, even more so in those days, I think, than today. So they were linked by marriage to Pinsonneau, Masson, McCallum, de Fleury Deschambault, Godefroy de Tonnancourt, Fauteux. Some of you may remember Gaspard Fauteux, who lived on Seminole Road down there, and so he was a cousin. Varin, Renaud, Sauvageau families. There doesn't seem to be any portraits of Jean-Baptiste of the second generation. However, we do have some. This is Jean-Moïse, a painting of Jean-Moïse. He's in his costume from the Collège de Montréal at that time. And here he is later on, a bit older. So Jean-Moïse's wife, Marie-Angélique Leroux, who's this woman here, was the daughter of Laurent Leroux, fur trader, businessman, justice of the peace, militia officer, office holder, and politician. He was established in l'Assomption. He's also an explorer. He is also in the dictionary. My mother and I were fascinated by Laurent Leroux. Story in particular, and some of the myths surrounding his origins, because I don't have time to get into it. However, my my sister Danielle and I actually went to France to try and trace the veracity of some of those rumors and myths in 2001. We didn't find anything confirming them. So this was the rendezvous. So he actually traveled with Mackenzie and was probably the first European in great slavery. Okay, we don't know very much about Maria Hermine's parents as such. Gustave Adolphe Raymond and Mathilde Philomène Boulette, or not yet, anyway. We know he was born in La Prairie, 1833 to 1900, studied at the Collège de l'Assomption in accounting, and they had 6 children. The last one died as an infant in 1864. Gustave spent most of his life working for the Sulpiciens, who, as you know, were the owners of the whole island of Montreal at one time. But even in the 1800s, they were still powerful and wealthy. So he worked for them as the general agent of the Sulpiciens, and he later on, in 1887, he was also an agent for the Phoenix Insurance Company of London. So Maria Hermine was born and baptized in Montreal on May 6, 1859. So she was 6 years younger than Louis Joseph. Oh, this is a photo of Marie-Angélique, wife of Jean-Louis Raymond. This was just probably a short time before she died. She was 101 years old when she died. So this is a photo of Maria Hermine at around 13 years of age. She did have a formal education in a convent in Montreal, but we don't know which one yet. As did one of her younger sisters as well, Ernestine. So we'll now look into the first years together of the couple, the births of their children, their family life, then an overview of business life, and then go to Bois de la Roche itself, before and after Louis Joseph's death, more or less where they're not order. And how are we going for time? Okay. How was I'm going quickly, but are we okay? Okay. So, the couple. One of the things that I became aware of in doing this research is that as Louis Joseph died in 1911, there really was no one from my mother's generation but one. So the 6 grandchildren that were born when he died. With one exception, Raymond Boyer, Danielle's father, the eldest grandchild of the couple, but he was only 5 when his grandfather died. Even Maria Hermine, who died in 1925, 14 years after her husband, at the time, my mother was only 7 years old, so she didn't really know her grandmother either. Her maternal grandmother, but she knew her paternal grandmother very well. So whatever recollections her other grandchildren had of her, unfortunately, don't really seem to have been transmitted to my generation. But here's what we do know. So on May 2nd, 1876, Louis Joseph and Maria Hermine were married in Notre Dame Cathedral in Montreal. He was 23 years old, and she was just shy by 4 days of her 17th birthday. The couple first lived probably from 1876 probably to 78, more or less 2 years, with her parents at 480 La Rochetière Street in Montreal. And in Locals, once again, their summer residence at that time is noted, as in La Prairie, where, as you remember, that's where her family came from. So I guess it was really at her parents' house or the family house there, where they would go for the summers during those beginning years. November 29th, 1876, is when the company, L.J. Forget and Company, was set up. And I've seen a notarized document that I found dated then that seems to indicate that it was Maria Hermine that set up the company in her name and as a stockbroker herself. I quote what was written in the document. Je, Dame Marie Raymond, entend faire commerce comme courtière, entre parenthèses, c'est indiqué stockbroker, sous le nom et raison de L.J. Forget Company, et que j'ai commencé ce jour à le faire comme suit. And then it goes on to state, L.J. Forget can use his signature to sign documents and things without being obliged to declare that he's acting as her fiduciaire, as if it were really her signature that he signed, his own signature. It ends ironically with Louis-Joseph authorizing Maria Hermine to do all of the above, because as you know, this was still at a time when women did not have legal capacity to do so unless they had their husband's formal authorization. But I thought that was, you know, I mean, you still have to look into it a little bit more and see if that's really what happened. But anyway, that notarized document, that seems to be the case. So she wasn't just supporting him, as is written in different documents. You know, she might have actually been the person who set it up. 2 years later, they moved out of her parents' house on La Gauchetière Street to a house on 216 Saint-Denis Street. As far as I know, we haven't done any research on that yet, and where they remained until 1884, so about 6 years they lived there. When they moved into their new house, then at 951 Sugar Street. From that information, I've gathered that my great-aunt Marie Alice, or Lulu as we knew her, who was born in 1877, was born then in her grandparents' house on La Gauchetière. And then at that time, Maria Hermine was 18 years old in 4 months. And while the following year, Marie-Louis Octave Alexandre Raymond, a year later, their only son, as well as Marie Blanche, would have been born when they lived on Saint-Denis Street. So that was sort of new information. I have some photos. So this portrait is of, on the right is Lulu, and on the left is Raymond, the son. They were a year apart. This is a portrait by William Raphael. I thought it was interesting. He was the first Jewish professional artist to establish himself in Montreal. He worked out of Notman Studio. My grandmother, Marianne Marguerite, I'm not sure the other one first. So here's a photo of Raymond. And here's a Notman photo of, I think, I would say that that's Mimi, that's Marguerite, probably 1 or 2. That would be Blanche at 4 or 5, and that would be Lulu at 6 or 7 and 8. Okay, so my grandmother, Marianne Marguerite, was born on the 27th of July, no grandchildren, not the 28th, and she was baptized the next day in St. Anne's. So I deduced that she was probably born in their summer house in St. Anne's, which means that they already had that in 1982, a bit earlier than what we originally believed. So this house here on the left, on the bottom left, that was, it's been blurry on first, was the Forget house in St. Anne's. And this is where it was. Here, they had, this was their property, and also the property across the road. This was Lakeshore Road. This was also part of that. And this was called the Grand Trunk. Maybe some of you historians here would know. But I think that's probably Maple Avenue now. Yeah. So, it'd be interesting to go and see what's there now, which I haven't done since I found this out. So Polly, Marie-Rose Pauline, she was born 7 years later in 1889, and she too was baptized in St. Anne's. She was probably the only child that was actually born in the first manor house in Senegal, in the first house of Bois de la Roche in Senegal. Okay, in March 82, a few months before Marguerite was born, Marie-Hermine bought the land on Sherbert Street from the estate of William Workman to build their house. She paid $8,270 for the land. And then in 1983, November 29th, disaster strikes, and Raymond dies, aged 5 years and 2.5 months. His mother, Marie-Hermine, is 24 years old. Louis-Joseph is 30, and Raymond's sisters, 6, 3, and 1 years old, respectively. Polly isn't born yet. We don't really know anything about Raymond's death at the moment, but we do know that on September 14th of the same year, just a few months before, that his mother signed a notarized document of dissolution stating that she had ceased to do business as a stockbroker under the name of Famille Forget and Company since September 1st. So it has been written that she withdrew from the company because it was now solidly on its feet, which no doubt was the case, but perhaps it was also because Raymond was already ill then. So the plans for the house on Sherbert Street are attributed to Maurice Perrault, as a well-known Montreal architect. And we recently realized that his parents were Marguerite's godparents, and she, Marie-Louise Octavie, was a maçon. So once again, the tie with the maçons, the Raymonds and the maçons and the Forgets now. So just another of one of those numerous connections that Louis-Joseph acquired by marrying into the Raymond family, and without any doubt played an important role in his growing prominence. The family moved into the new house in 1884. So this is the house on Sherbert Street. It underwent considerable renovations by the Maxwells in 1901 or 1902 to be finished in 1903. We have with us here today Bruce Bolton and my cousin Danielle Boyer, who are very knowledgeable on this house, so if anybody wants some questions about it afterwards, they'll be. This is a little brochure that's been made by the McDonald Stewart Foundation, who bought the house, renovated it, and have done fantastic work there. So they have answers for you. Yeah.
And we brought an ample supply of the brochures for you after the talk.
Donc, Bois de la Roche during Louis-Joseph's lifetime. So most of the information for this section of our presentation is actually readily available on the Village of Centerville's website. And maybe some of you have seen it. If not, you can now go and see it. It's under History, 2017. The document is called Énoncé de l'intérêt patrimonial du Bois de la Roche. It was prepared by a working group, which I had the privilege of participating in at the end, thanks to Léo Viau. It was set up by the Division du Patrimoine, Direction de l'Urbanisme de la Ville de Montréal. I have a copy of it here, but it is up on the website of the Village of Centerville. Have any of you seen it? No? Okay. So I'll go over some of the main points of interest. First of all, it's interesting, only really sunk in when I was doing the research, that if the whole of Bois de la Roche covered about 500 acres of land, in the beginning it was much, much smaller. In 1886, in 1886, so Louis Joseph bought lot number 6, which also included this bit here, where the house is, on which he built the first manor, according to the plans of the architect John William Hopkins. The stone farmer's house was also built at that time, replacing a wooden building, a barn with some dependencies in 1886, and the horse stable in 1887. Those were enlarged by the Maxwells later on. So I have some photos of the first house. I quite like it.
That's where Bois de la Roche
Is now.
is.
This was Bois de la Roche.
Yeah.
It's the back side of it.
That would be the lakeside?
Yeah. That would be the lakeside and the two first pictures for the front side. Okay, 1891, so 5 years after we got lot number 6, and lot number 3, where the Joseph Nallon house is. Whoops. Do you want to see it?
Yes.
Okay. So lot number 3. Whoop, put that in there. And that's 40 points there. So lot number 3 was bought 5 years after the first lot. And then another 5 years after that, another disaster. The manoir was destroyed by fire. At that time, the family, they were 43 years old, 37, 19, 16, 14, and 7 years old. So that house was gone. And then 2 years later, in 1898, part of lot number 7 was bought. And then a year after that, lot number 55. And then 3 years after the first house had burned, 1899, up to 1902, the new house was built according to the plans of Edward Maxwell. One thing that isn't noted that often, but I think very interesting, however, of course, the Olmsted brothers, landscape artists, considered to be the fathers of landscape architecture in the U.S., were commissioned to do the grounds and entrances to the manor. They're the guys who also did Mount Royal Park, Central Park, and many other famous sites. Around 1902, also, Frederick Gage Todd, who apprenticed with the Olmsteds, and who's known as Canada's first landscape architect, prepared a plan to situate the four houses and their entrances on Whaley Point, which is number 3 on the water side, probably for the 4 daughters at that time. At the same time, the root cellar, the chicken house, and the piggery were built. In 1904, part of lot 4 was bought, and in 1905, lots 1 and 2. And then in 1908, the rest of lot 4, including the Eustache Boulot house, and then Bois de la Roche was complete. That basically covered the 500 acres. And 2 years after that, Phillips Avenue opened. I was asked if I knew what was produced on the farm and how many workers there were and where they lived. So it was certainly Louis Joseph's intention to develop a model farm with a diversified production with registered cattle and horses, and which would have included orchards, vineyards, fields, grain, pastures, and a large vegetable garden. When my great-aunt Lulu was in charge, so from 1911 up to 1960s, it probably wasn't that different from the earlier period, and I have the journal of the farm for some of those years. So in that, I found, for example, that from August 26th to July 27th, 59 calves were born. So that means that there were probably 59 cows, which is a big herd for that time. So obviously milk was a major production. There were also laying hens and pigs. As for crops, there were hay, oats, wheat, barley, pretty well the staples of any dairy farm in Quebec up to about 40 years ago, when corn and soya started taking over. Unfortunately, I don't really know how many workers were employed during Louise Joseph's and Maria Hermine's time, but according to my cousin Bonnie, who's here, on the third floor of the house, of the Roche house, there were 4 or 5 bedrooms for the house staff who lived in, those who lived in, and that they shared one bathroom. There was also a large room for sewing. So there seems, though, to have been quite a few less people working on the property than at the Clouston Todd's, where, according to Armand Quillon, said in Je me souviens that there were 14 people in the house and 40 outside. Or at the Angus's house, where there were 15 maid rooms that, in fact, I really don't have a clue. It's just, I'm trying to deduce from what we do know. We do know, however, at least from Michel Legault's recollections, that he left Bois-de-la-Roche to go to work for the Angus's because the pay was much better over there. So business and political life. Okay, yeah. Just tight, okay. You remember that the couple set up the stockboat company in the end of 1876, and at that time he brought Rodolphe, his nephew, into the company to work. So he was the son of the older brother, David. And then in 1890, he became a partner in the company, and for 17 years they were truly a formidable team. When in 1875, oh yes, so much of the business stuff I'm not going to go into in great detail. You can find it in these books. This is the book Les Mémoires de Madame Francoeur that we have a copy of, and you can find it. Probably hard to find, but you could probably see that the Bibliothèque Nationale. So there's lots of sort of day-to-day information there.
That book's been digitized by the BNQ.
Oh, yeah, okay. So Danielle says that book has been digitized on the website of the Bibliothèque et Archives Nationales du Québec. And then there's this book that came out just a short time ago, well, a couple of years probably. Courtier et entrepreneur, le courtage financier au Québec, 1867-1987. So there's a lot on all the business intrigues and deals and stuff in there. Yeah, John.
Somebody showed me a book of who's who in Canada going back. And then I went about Alger Forget.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to say is that he was known for his integrity.
Yeah.
If there was a rumor, and he said it was false, that was the end of the rumor. If he said it was true, that was it.
Yeah.
But his integrity was unquestioned.
Yeah, and his obituary in the Star, I think, points that out. Oh yes, so in 1875, just really a year after he became a stockbroker, He was already transacting just himself, because the company wasn't even set up yet then, as far as I know anyway. My information is correct. Almost 3% of the value of all transactions on the Montreal Stock Exchange. And then 5 years later, it was up to 20%. Then by 1890, Forget and Company's share of the market reached just under 57%. And in 1900, it was still just under 50% of the value of all transactions. So it's, Louis Joseph was elected president of the Montreal Stock Exchange in 1895 and then re-elected in 1896. So I'm not, as I mentioned, I'm not going into a lot of detail regarding the deals and intrigues. It's way beyond my limited understanding of business dealings in the stock market. But if you are interested, go to those two documents. But briefly, I will say the sort of main areas where he invested, I guess, or was involved in. So beyond the millions of dollars that he made for his 200 to 250 clients and himself on the stock market over the years, the Forgets were directly involved in vast mergers that were part of capitalism's rapid development at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries, and from which they and their shareholders greatly profited, obviously. The first sector that they were in was the public utilities that were privately owned at the time, specifically the production and distribution of electricity and the tramway companies. In the case of the tramway system, Louis Joseph became president in 1892 of the Montreal Street Railway Company. He remained in that position after the mergers until the end of his life. And during that time, the company transitioned from horses to electricity, which was happening everywhere, but in Montreal and in Toronto, actually, Forget was involved in it, more than involved in it. The value of the shares increased from $100 to $337 a share. Oh, there's a funny cartoon. Oh, I didn't show you the pictures of the house. Skipped over that. Oh well. Anyway, we'll just do this quickly. So there's Louis Joseph in front of the house, in the second house, I would say, because I don't think the first house had the wall at the beginning. And these are pictures of the house as it is now, not really as it was when they lived there, or even when I was a child. I'm going to show this now. Oh yeah, so I have quickly a few. So that's Marguerite, Mimi, my grandmother, sitting beside the lions. That's Polly. They're not unfortunately in proper order. We don't know really the dates of most of the things. There's Maria Hermine here. Can you see that one? Yeah. Lulu, possibly Blanche here. This is where they play tennis. They had a tennis court on the lawn there, and this is my grandmother Mimi. This is swimming. You can see Lulu's writing here. Le Bois de la Roche Sainte-Ville, 1898. I'm not sure. I thought that at one point that might be Guy and the Blaze, but I don't think it is, but it might be. We'll have to look at it again. There's Mimi again, snowshoeing. There's the chapel, and you know of, the inside of it. And there's LJ. And the only picture I have when he's sort of in, what do you call it, easy pose, walking with, I don't know who, someone who lived there or a friend, I don't know. So this is at the, so this is the farmer house, the stone house near the road on Pointe Lavache. Before it burned down, remember, it did burn down, it was rebuilt in the 20s.
Okay.
So this would have been before. This one here, I think is my grandmother, so I recognize her somehow. And this is the pond, little pond where the ducks were playing in. Also, that white fence means that it was at the, here's Lulu in the barnyard about to go out for a ride. That's a more recent picture of Louis, our cousin Louis, going for a ride in front of the stable, in front of the barn. Okay, that's enough. Have that coffee fit? So, okay, so this is the ticket from the tramway that my cousin Danielle sent to me. You can see here's LJ Forget's signature on the bottom. President. It's bon pour un passage. Oh, and this is the cartoon that I was talking about. The good conductor. Le sénateur Forget, président de la Montreal Street Rail Company, vu par ses actionnaires, very happy, dans le rôle d'un bon percepteur. There's LJ here and his happy shareholders.
Est-ce qu'il y a une date plus loin?
Hein?
Is there a date for this lower on
well,
the picture?
No, that's the rest, that's more,
Yes,
no, there is
it
a,
says 58.
no, that's page 58.
Ah, okay.
But it was all around the early 1900s. Actually, no, it was anywhere from 1892 to the early 1900s. So Louis Joseph was instrumental in carrying out the merger also of electricity and gas companies, ending with the creation of the Montreal Heat and Power Company in 1901. That deal involved $17 million. And I looked it up, I don't know how accurate or how much you can accept this, but take it for granted or not, but 100, how do I say it? 100, in 1900 years, in the 1900s, $100 is today worth $3,500, taking into account inflation. So you can do the math, we're talking about lots of money. This monopoly situation enabled the company to impose high tariffs on Montreal consumers and rake in considerable profits. So in February of 1903, the first tramway strike broke out, paralyzing transportation in Montreal. There were about 1,500 workers on strike, fighting for the recognition of their union and higher wages. After 2 days of strike, they wanted a 10% increase and held a grand victory march. There was also another strike, not much longer after that. So that's some things commemorating the strike. This was an actual souvenirs that I could have. In February of the second area was navigation, specifically the Richelieu and Ontario Navigation Company, which later became the Canada Steamships. So I'm going to skip over some of the stuff because we're taking too long. So the Forgets were experts, obviously, in financing mergers and what we would call today, I guess, the engineering of companies. Another great area of interest was the spectacular mergers of the industrial textile companies, which ended up merging, and the outcome of that was the Dominion Cotton Mills. The Dominion Textile Company, with Louis Joseph as its first vice president. There again, over 6,000 workers struck in 1900. a very violent strike. They sent out strike breakers, and police came out from Montreal, and then these were mainly women workers, and probably with their children as well. One thing I was quite amazed to find out that Famille Forget and Company never had a staff of more than 5 or 7 people. It seems to me very small, you know, when you consider the sort of empire that they had built. And the other thing that I was sort of happy to see was that when Madame Francoeur, the woman who wrote those memoirs, was hired as secretary stenographer, and during all the years that she worked there, that she was the only woman in that position in St. James Street.
Oh.
So, yeah, but you know, at least it's a bit of a redeeming quality that they actually hired the only woman to do this work. That's what I thought. Politics, I'm going to go really quickly on this. So he was an active member of the Conservative Party. In 1885, of course, when the territory of Senegal was detached from St. Anne's, he was the first mayor, and he was re-elected and remained mayor until his death. He was first replaced in June 1911 by F.W. Wanklyn, who was an Angus by marriage, and then a few months later, when Wanklyn resigned, by his son-in-law, Guy Boyer. So social involvements, activities, and travels. We're almost there. So he was a director and a benefactor of many institutions and associations: Notre Dame Hospital, Montreal General Hospital, the Art Association of Montreal, which is now the Musée des Beaux-Arts, and many others. He was also a founding member of the Montreal Mount Royal Club, St. James, a member of St. James, Royal St. Lawrence Yacht Club, Forest and Stream, and of course the Senegal Golf Links. Along with, in that case, with the Angus, Clouston, and Morgan families. One thing that's, I didn't put this up, but I don't know how many of you have had poems written about you. Not in my case. I would think it's pretty rare. Well, Louis Joseph had 2 poems written about him, praising him, from 2 well-known at the time Quebec poets, one by Louis Honoré Fréchette, entitled Le Bois de la Roche, in 1902, and another by William Chapman in 1904, simply as "À Monsieur le Sénateur Louis-Joseph Forget," in which he praises him for the donation he made to the city of Montreal to buy coal for the poor. Well, I thought that was pretty extraordinary, that two poems written about you by well-known poets. We have numerous photos of the travels in Europe: Egypt, Holy Land, Western Canada. I'll only show you a few of those. I mentioned that they're involved in the Richelieu, Ontario, what was it called, steamship. So this is, they're obviously traveling on one of the ships, the Colonians, that's afterwards. So all these people, I don't know, except here's Maria Hermine. Here in the background, hiding, is Louis Joseph. Here's Polly. Here's Mimi, Marguerite, and here is Lulu. And this was in 1906, I think, so Blanche was already married, and yeah. So it was on board the SS Corona in May of 1906. So they did go, it seems to me at least, we have so many photos, none of them are, very few of them are dated. Sometimes it says where they were, and it looks like there are albums from at least 3 of the daughters with a lot of the same photos. So it's quite hard to démêler all of this. So they took 6 major trips, what I found so far anyway from Ancestry. 1891, 1901, 1904, 1906, 1910, and 1909, and then the last one in 1910. I'll just read a couple of notes from some of them. So on what seems to have been the first trip in 1891, the party was composed of Louis-Joseph, 38, Marie-Hermine, 32, Lulu, 14, Blanche, 11, Marguerite, 9 years old, and Polly is listed as a child, not yet 2 years old, as well as a maid. And probably at that time, I thought it would have been here. It's not. Anyway, I'll just go through these photos. So this is the photo, trip, obviously, to Egypt. There's Alger there on the left. Here they are here on horseback. Here they are here. These are, I think the 3 daughters. Not 3 of the daughters. I'm not 100% sure. On camels or dromedaries, I don't know which. So there's Alger. Others. This is quite interesting. So these are photo postcards that Maria sent to her parents in Montreal while they were there. So it says, Le Caire, 26 février 1904, meilleur souhait. So you can see Alger, Maria Hermine, doesn't look very well there already. Polly, Mimi, and Lulu, I think. And I think that was Mr. Pace, who was Lulu's tutor. My mother seemed to have remembered that. This is again Maria Hermine, Le Caire. There's LJ. And this is what she wrote on the back of these postcards. So Madame Dussard, my love, Raymond, 321A. She was living then on Sherwood Street. This is Place Saint-Marc. You see LJ there having fun with all the birds landing on him. And Maria Hermine and one of the girls. Maybe, I don't know. No, she would have been not, well, maybe. I don't know what year it is. Yes, okay. Yeah, so here's LJ, Maria Hermine, and Polly. So this, I think, was probably their first trip, because they both look quite a bit younger here. Maria, and this is at the l'Hôtel des Anglais in Nice. They seem to go there every trip. And here's Guy, I think, Guy Boyer, and Blanche, one of the daughters, and here are the parents over there. There's Guy, LJ, Lulu, Blanche, and Guy, and there's Danielle. Oops. So I wanted to show you this.
I'm setting up the painting.
Okay. So in 1901, Blanche married Guy Boyer, and then they were on the trip with the rest of the Forgets in 1904. You just saw some of those pictures. In February 1909, only 4 of them went, because both, 1909, both Lulu and Blanche were married. And this is a picture, where did I think it's supposed to be here, isn't it? Here we go. Oh, so this is the portrait of Maria Hermine, which is in the house on Sherwood Street with Danielle. So this was done by the French painter and engraver Benjamin Constant, known for his Orientalist paintings. He was also known as a favored portraitist of French and British high society. So the painting by Benjamin Constant of Maria Hermine was probably done at that time in 1891, when they went to France. There was some question about it at one point because the artist also came to Montreal in 1888, but I think he was just there for a few years. Okay. Okay, one more.
Marianne, can I just say I don't hop on furniture at the Forget House all the time? We were just having a visit for the University Club, and I was setting up the painting, and Bruce took a photo.
So this is Lulu's wedding at Bois de la Vache. In June of 1907. So there is Lulu, so Marie-Alice, Waldo Skinner, and his témoin was James Angus, who John Angus tells me was the black sheep of their family. And Louis Joseph was his daughter's témoin. Okay, so Louis Joseph's death. So apparently he had been diagnosed with a heart lesion several years before. In her memoirs, Madame Franca writes that in 1910, after a holiday with his family to New York and Atlanta, Louis Joseph showed signs of great lassitude. He complained that his hand felt as though it were constrained in a glove. In mid-June, he went on his annual fishing trip to his reserve on the Bonaventure, where he had counted on resting up some more. Alas, he came home on a gurney, having been struck by paralysis on July 1st while waiting to take the train home. He partially recovered from the attack, but he did not feel that he was up to leading a struggle against a move on the shares of the Montreal Street riot at the time. And he and his family left on December 10th to go overseas again on the Mauritania from New York to Liverpool. Madame Franca says that at first the letters home seemed to indicate some improvement. However, as the family were preparing to leave Nice for Paris in the beginning of April, he died during the night before the planned departure, April 7th, 1911, 58 years of age. 3 months later, after liquidation, La Maison Famille Forget et Compagnie no longer existed as it had before. It did continue to exist, but what she's saying, it was never really what it was before when the Forgets were there. Maria Hermine's life up to her death on October 22nd, 1925, at 66 years old. So she saw her two youngest girls married after their father's death. Polly in 1914, May, to Frederick Johnson. And a few months later, Marguerite married Armand Chevalier on October 17th, 1914. She continued to live both in the house, as I understand it, in Montreal and in Bois de la Vache with her daughter Lulu and her son-in-law. She did travel to England in 1915. She accompanied her daughter Marguerite, who gave birth to her firstborn there, Paul, while Armand, Marguerite's husband, was serving with the 22e Regiment during World War I. We have photos of her. This will be the last photos, I think, and then we're almost finished. Oh yeah, well, let's go over that. I wanted to show you some things there, but I won't. So here is Maria Hermine with her first grandchild, Guy Boyer, Raymond Boyer.
My dad.
Yeah. Danielle's father. And here's actually Waldo with him. And here's Maria Hermine with Louis and Paul, who were the next two grandchildren. I know that because Mommy told me. And, so
it must be true.
It must be true. Exactly. She was able to recognize him. I think that's the end of the photos. Okay. So, Bois de la Vache for now, from And you stand it another 7 minutes? Okay. So from 1911 to the late 1950s, our great aunt Lulu was responsible for Bois de la Roche. Her husband Waldo died in 1943. The farm itself was, as I understand it, a kind of showcase for the modernization of farming in Quebec at the time. However, as in the 1960s, Lulu was already well into her 80s. The property was transferred to Bois de la Roche Inc., which was incorporated in 1962, and whose shareholders were basically the members of the 9th generation to run and administer the farm and property. Around 1969, no, I wanted to say something else first. Oh no, we already talked about that. Okay. At that time, Bois de la Roche Inc., so the newly set up company, rented our cousin Louis Johnson's farm in Saint-Geneviève from him and purchased all his farm equipment. It also hired Louis as its general manager. These are documented, documented contracts. He presented an annual report of his activities to the shareholders, who for some time did include some of us from the 10th generation at annual general meetings. Then there were basically 3 big projects that occurred, one after the other, leading up to right now. So around 1969, Jamie Morgan met with Leo Vio at the request of Toby Johnson, president of Bois de la Roche Inc. The former was working on a project with the Zoological Society of Canada that would have included Bois de la Roche, the property of Bois de la Roche. In the end, it didn't work out. Then, a short time later, some of the same people, Jamie Morgan, Greg Weil, Leo Vio, met to discuss a new project that would become the Société du Parc Écologique de Montréal in Centerville. The project was aimed at the protection of wildlife with an interesting educational role. And it had the approval at the time of the mayor, Cameron Duff. And the board included Barty Morgan, Mary Weil, Jean-Louis Pilon, Jay Hackney, Roger Biden, Greg Weil, Leo Vio, Jamie Morgan, and Toby Johnson representing Bois de la Roche. And there was a lot of interest that was shown and support given to that project. Unfortunately, a major prospective funder pulled out with the election of the PQ. Luckily, though, Leo Vio, who was president of that society, persevered and with the authorization of his board approached Dr. Pierre Dansereau, eminent ecologist and professor at the Université du Québec in Montréal, and asked Dansereau if he would come out to visit the site. Just around all that time, Lulu died in 1977, a few days before her 100th birthday. Then the third project, so everyone was, so the third project emanated from this contact with Pierre Dansereau. Everybody was very enthusiastic about the project, and the Association du Parc Agricole was set up with a lot of the same people, Leo Vio, Jay Hackney, Pierre Bélanger-Lesage, Dansereau. And Dansereau developed the concept of the project and just done the documentation around, I think, on that. I think there's a lot of questions I know always being asked about, well, how did you let those buildings fall down and all this kind of stuff. You have to remember that by 1986, the members of that 9th generation were already in their late 60s and early 70s. And it was already very clear that no one, either individually or collectively, from my generation, the 10th, was capable nor interested in taking on such a huge responsibility. So in 1986, the main house and the acres that it sits on were sold. And then in 1991, Bois de la Roche Inc. sold 470 acres of its land, including the 11 buildings that were still left to the MUC. Many conditions were attached to the sale, mainly inferring that the Montreal urban community would integrate the objectives developed by the Parc agricole into its future objectives. La Société pour le développement et la promotion du Parc agricole du Bois de la Roche was formed and remained active until 2004. It's taken a long time, but it finally looks like this is the plan for the Grand Parc de l'Ouest moving forward, and including an important educational aspect on the history of agriculture and so on in the area. We may actually see the vision put forward for the recognition of the développement of Bois de la Roche as a parc agricole realized in the not so distant future. That's always pretty relative, but anyway. And on that note, I would end.